From Michigan Public, this is It's Just Politics. I'm Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
The Democratic Party is figuring out what comes next. And Pete Buttigieg has some thoughts.
We've never been a command and control kind of party. We are chaotic, and we might as well acknowledge that.
We sat down last week with the former mayor, former U.S. Transportation Secretary, and now Michigan resident in Traverse City for the annual Michigan Association of Broadcasters Conference.
As part of a special Issues and Ale, we talked with Buttigieg about a whole range of things. Artificial intelligence.
Something it is obvious he's really interested in.
What he's thinking about when he thinks about whether he'd run for office.
And just the state of the country right now.
We're not just divided in our opinions about what just happened. We're divided on what just happened. We are divided on the facts.
Today, we are bringing you a part of that conversation. And we'll start with my first question, which is actually more of a memory. That 13 years ago, in 2012, here at Michigan Public, then Michigan Radio, in a conversation I had with then NPR reporter Sonari Glinton. Sonari had just gotten back from a reporting trip to South Bend, Indiana. And I remember this still more than a decade later. He comes back and he says, I just interviewed the 30-year-old mayor of South Bend. And he could run for president. And I'm like, South Bend, Indiana? 30 years old? What are you talking about? But here we are now 13 years later, and he was absolutely right. And so after all of these years, I have been so interested in asking Buttigieg, who has, of course, run for president, if he could go back in time, what he would tell that 30-year-old.
Oh, gosh. Whole bunch of things. I mean, I remember what a big deal it was that a national NPR reporter was coming to South Bend, Indiana, and showing interest in our city's story back then. And just to be clear, I didn't start my career saying, all right, I'm gonna run for state treasurer, I'm gonna get clobbered, then I'll turn around and become mayor, and then if the second term goes well, I can go straight to the presidency. I was really preoccupied with just making sure that the city found a different future. And I think that looking back, I would definitely encourage my younger self to commit to some of the risks that we took, because at the time it wasn't clear that those were going to pay off, whether it was the way we reimagined the streetscapes to try to bring life back to the heart of the city, or the approach we took in the neighborhoods to try to deal with the vacant and abandoned housing that really dominated entire neighborhoods in our city's west side, or the interest we were showing in the economy of data centers, little knowing what that would mean years later in the era of artificial intelligence.
A big deal here right now, too.
Everywhere, absolutely. And we should get into this because I think the implications are actually
You've been thinking a lot about it.
Mixed. But I think the biggest thing is that you cannot plan what is going to happen next on the political side. You should have your plans on the policy side. But politics is just a very, very strange world. And actually, this is advice I got when I first worked up the courage to tell my predecessor, Joe Kernan, who had been mayor of South Bend and then governor, that I was thinking of running for mayor. We were at this place, Joe's Tavern, actually, it was called. It was a very modest place on the west side that he liked to hang out at. And he stared at his French fries for a long time in silence and then looked up and just said, so much in politics is outside of your control. And learning to be at peace with that is probably the most important personal thing I've learned in terms of how to navigate that entire scene. But I'm so proud of South Bend. I mean, we met our objectives in so many ways. The census numbers came back after my 2 terms as mayor had ended, but when they did, they showed us having the strongest population growth, the strongest economic growth we'd had since well before I was born. And my successor, James Mueller, is doing a fantastic job taking that to the next level.
I want to talk big picture here. You mentioned at that moment what a big deal it was to have this NPR reporter come. And, we're here in front of all of these broadcasters talking about what it means to tell regional stories right now. But the big picture is we're a really divided country, it feels like. And some of that is the way that folks receive messages from local mayors or governors. I've been really curious over the past few years as I hear pundits or broadcasters or politicians say we have never been more divided as a country. There was a caning on the U.S. Senate floor. There were presidential, horrific assassinations.
Duels.
This country fought a civil war. What do you think when you hear someone say the country has never been more divided?
Yeah, I think it is important to recognize on one hand, it is true that the country has not been this divided in living memory. It has not been this divided in modern times. And so I think for us, in terms of a practical reality, that statement might as well be true, except that it's not strictly true. Some of the things we're going through are more precedented than it seems. And it's especially interesting to consider from a broadcast and journalism perspective. So for example, obviously with the rise of digital media, one thing that we're divided in now that is tectonic and incredibly dangerous is that we're not just divided in our opinions about what just happened. We're divided on what just happened. We are divided on the facts. Maybe saying that is a contradiction in terms. We're divided in terms of which facts are believed by whom and what actually is a fact. That seems novel, and in some ways it is. With the rise of artificial intelligence, it feels like we're losing our grasp on certain ways of knowing what is true. A photograph, for example, right? For the entire time any of us have been alive, indeed for the last 100 years, a photograph was dispositive evidence that just decisively settled a question of fact. There's an argument over a certain fact, and you could produce photographic evidence. That was usually the end of the argument. And now it's not, because AI can produce photorealistic images on demand. But of course, most of human history, we didn't have photography to settle arguments, and we still settled arguments somehow. So my point is, we have faced some of these different versions of these same challenges before. And one thing I would look to is the 19th century, that Civil War era you mentioned, which in some ways parallels what we're living through now, where we're in our different internet feeds and therefore have a different account of what's going on in the country. Because there's a good chance if this were the 1850s, maybe you would have your abolitionist newspaper that you read, and I would have a Democrat newspaper that I read, and somebody would have a know-nothing, or there would be all these different media outlets, which really were at the time much more nakedly partisan, openly biased, and often reporting different things, only some of which were fact. So if we got through that, we can get through this. It would be better if we could get through this without a civil war.
I have to wonder, because you rightly pointed out that the nonpartisan media, at least in the non-editorial pages, is a relatively historically recent innovation.
Yeah.
And now we seem to be moving towards a partisan electronic online media. And can we pivot back to some place where there are places where there are common agreements about what facts are? Like, when you think about that, do you see a path evolving in that direction, how it might happen?
I think there's appetite for it in theory. And I think in some ways that's not just something that should be left up to the journalistic community to solve. This is also a policy question. The loss of the fairness doctrine, I think, is something that we're all still living with in terms of what happened on broadcast media. Section 230 means there's an equivalent dynamic on digital media. And I think that's deeply problematic. I think that there is a responsibility within the journalistic world, too, to come to terms with how editorial standards might play out in digital formats. And it's why I'm still somebody who believes in picking up a newspaper, turning on local television or radio wherever I go. Another way to put it is this. I know there's a temptation to think that digital media mean that the role of journalists has somehow been demoted or diminished. That's something that people feel, I think, because it turns out anybody can be a reporter, because anybody can get pretty high quality video footage of whatever they happen to witness without waiting until a professional reporter arrives on the scene. Anybody can be a columnist in an era when some dude on the internet can command as much audience as a columnist, let's say, at the New York Times. But I think that precisely because that reporting and that opining can be done by anybody and can reach anybody, what I would call the editorial function, the job of checking what is factual and what is not factual, the job of presenting different sides of an issue, is not diminished in its importance. It's actually more important than ever. The hard part, of course, is applying that editorial function in online spaces where the people who are reporting, so to speak, or opining, are not accountable to anyone except their own audience.
You're listening to It's Just Politics. I am Zoe Clark, here with Rick Pluta, bringing you our recent conversation with former U.S. Transportation Secretary, former presidential candidate, and now Michigan resident Pete Buttigieg.
And because this is It's Just Politics, we, of course, needed to talk politics.
I was curious about how Buttigieg is thinking right now about the Democratic Party, this push and pull between the more centrist elements of the party, someone like Michigan Senator Alyssa Slotkin, and the more progressive, like New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani. The Democratic Party has tried to maintain that it is a big tent. But what does Buttigieg think about if that's possible right now?
I think it's fine for us to have, in fact, better than fine, I think it's healthy for us to have a broad and large coalition. I think it will be important, though, for our party to do a better job of remembering that that coalition is for the same general direction of travel. Look, it's true that we have always been, we've never been a command and control kind of party. We are chaotic, and we might as well acknowledge that. But let's be clear about just how chaotic, to the point of incoherence, the other party is right now, right? You have, in one part of that party, or the traditional Republican Party, you have conservative libertarians who are so libertarian that they felt that the Clean Water Act was an expression of government tyranny, right? And they are in coalition now with nationalists, I would say authoritarians, who are comfortable snatching people off the streets, having federal agents wearing masks pull people off the streets because of op-eds that they wrote, which actually is the sort of thing I would have thought of during dorm room arguments over beers back in the day as a libertarian nightmare. Yet now it's progressives who are sounding the alarm about that. They are in coalition with people whose fortunes depend on the internet and in some cases the electric vehicle industry, working alongside people who are doing everything in their power to delete any reference to, let alone action on, the reality of climate change. So that is a deeply contradictory coalition held together by the personality of Donald Trump. And I think a very big question is when he leaves the stage, which sooner or later, somehow or another, he will, what is left of the Republican Party? But that doesn't absolve my party of getting its act together.
Right, because what you have just laid out sounds very bad to many. And yet that party, that dynamic, the approval rate is higher right now than the Democratic Party. What is, I mean, you've talked about this, that is a messaging issue.
More than messaging, but I do think it's important for us to do two things. One, to remember our home base in terms of substance. We're a party that believes that government ought to be there for the least among us and for those who most need the support of their government, and should not be stacked to make the wealthiest even more wealthy and the most comfortable even more comfortable. A fact that has been thrown into stark relief by the passage of the budget that is going to kick people off Medicaid in order to fund tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. We're a party that actually agrees with approximately 2/3 of Americans on most major issues. We'll come back in a minute to why we can't seem to get a 51% majority in any given election at the national level. But on the issues, you can find issues where we have unpopular positions rooted in our values, but for the most part, 2/3 of Americans believe that we should be taxing the wealthy more and not less. 2/3 of Americans at least are against the cuts to Medicaid that are going on. 2/3 of Americans acknowledge that climate change is a reality. 2/3 of Americans believe in a woman's right to choose. 2/3 of Americans believe in marriage equality for a family like mine. Way more than 2/3 of Americans believe that we should at least have background checks on the purchases of guns. I could go on down the list. But it is very clear that my party has failed to bring our message to people who don't already agree with it. And that was hard enough 5 years ago when I was getting beat up for going on Fox News as much as I did. It's that much harder now when we are trying to reach out to a generation of people, including young voters, some of whom I talked to who cast their very first vote ever for Joe Biden and their second presidential vote ever for Donald Trump. Finding them where they are when they're not watching any television, Fox, MSNBC, or anything in between. They're getting their news from programs that don't even claim to be news programs, namely podcasts. If we can't bring our message there, then we are going to continue to find ourselves in the minority.
But is this
simply a messaging problem? I mean, policy is an expression of values. Politics is an expression of values. Does messaging fix that? Or do you also have a values and policy problem that you have to fix?
I think we definitely missed some important policy priorities over the last few years. I think my party was very slow to understand that the problems at the border were real and that we needed to demonstrate more attention to the problem of immigration reform. To be fair, we cared about it and were part of bipartisan efforts to do something about it that the president blocked. But still, I think you can fault our party for not being prepared to be really serious in our proposals around making sure that the border was less chaotic. I think that's just one example. I think we, in our, very understandable zeal to confront a crisis which killed more than 1 million Americans, were slow to demonstrate that we were as concerned as anybody about getting schools back open. So we can go through a list of areas where we should be introspective about our policies. But I do think that if you have a political movement whose policies enjoy pretty high level of majority support of Americans, if you're only asking about the policies, you have to ask yourself some questions about why most people don't look at you and see those policies that they agree with.
That gets to the expression of those policies, how they're represented, and who represents them. Do you think that Democrats would have done better in the last presidential election if President Biden had stepped aside sooner, maybe opened the door for an open primary, or given Kamala Harris more time to present herself?
And if you want to take like 3 big
maybe I
gulps
should
of that.
chug that. No, I think especially now with the benefit of hindsight, that much is clear. Of course, that's a conclusion that the president himself reached, but reached that conclusion very late in the game. I also think that there is a risk. I mean, every couple of weeks there's some new hot, buzzy internet item that tries to throw us back mentally into 2024. I think the sooner we can be paying attention to skating where the puck is going, especially given what's happening to us, not just in terms of shocking developments every single day in our nation's politics, but things that would be a massive problem for our society, even if our politics were going along perfectly fine, of which I would put artificial intelligence number 1 on the list. We need to be ready to think about our next leadership, our next set of challenges, next set of problems, and other than for the purpose of learning lessons, we need to put the past where it belongs, which is in the past.
Do you see any political coalition, a political party or otherwise, that's coalescing around a solution or solutions to the challenges of AI?
To me, one of the most interesting things about the issue of AI is it doesn't yet have an obvious partisan valence. It would be hard to say, here's the Democrat view or the Republican view on AI. There's a little bit of one materializing on how much we want to do by way of guardrails, because the Trump administration released its roadmap, which basically says, go for it, and we're not that worried about any problems you create along the way. We trust you. That is one I'm skeptical of. But really, I think precisely because this moment is one where there's not yet a simple left-right ideological valence to the issue of AI, we can have a healthier conversation that's not as stultifying and as locked in and frankly as dumb as the partisan fights over a lot of other issues. But as we learned with something like vaccination, which 6 years ago, if you'd asked me if I ever thought that would be a partisan issue, I would think you were nuts. Anything can take on a partisan quality with shocking speed. All the more reason for us to think about this now before it does that.
Are we spending enough time talking about AI? I mean, like I hear you say this, I've heard you say elsewhere, we are going to just see massive disruptions, but it's almost like we can't comprehend. I think about it like the size of the universe. Our brains almost can't quite. Are we spending enough time in thinking about it?
So a couple thoughts. One, no, I think we're not spending enough time thinking about it. And part of it, I would use another metaphor related to yours that I used to use with my team at the Department of Transportation. We were trying to deal with big stuff, which is, if you've ever traveled to Washington, D.C., if you ever had the experience of walking right up to the Washington Monument, because you can just, you can just stick your hand on it. If you do, and you look up, it is impossible to tell the shape or size of the structure you're touching. It's too big and you're too close. And I think there's a bit of that quality that just confounds our ability to think clearly. It's one thing to say, here's this technology that's going to change a lot of things for you. It's another to say that whole categories of professions are going to be either wiped out or profoundly changed, not in 100 years, but in like 5.
Yeah.
I think most of the attention that is being paid to AI is the sci-fi zombie apocalypse stuff, which, by the way, I would take seriously. But I think we're so interested in some of those safety scenarios that we're not paying nearly enough attention to the economic implications of this. This is an area where I would argue that politicians, journalists, and business leaders in the industrial Midwest are especially qualified to help America tackle this. If for no other reason than our part of the country witnessed probably the closest thing to this, in terms of the political economy of it, in the 90s, when a wave of new technology, trade, globalization, and automation, and we were told, don't worry about your slice because the pie's going to get so much bigger, everybody's going to be just fine. And the pie got bigger, but a lot of slices didn't, including in places like South Bend, Indiana, where I grew up, and so many communities around the state of Michigan, which I would argue led directly to the kind of mistrust in institutions that has led to the rise of populism and phenomena like the Trump presidency. And if that was the impact of what happened then, in the 90s and early 2000s, what I think might be about to happen is 100 times greater. So the newsrooms that covered that phenomenon and all of the attempts to deal with it, some that worked better than others, people who understand why a retraining program is not enough to settle somebody's loss of their entire identity and sense of belonging, who covered the fact that the places where, even if the pie got bigger, this slice didn't. Or to switch metaphors, the rising tide lifted, but some of the boats just stayed tied right to the bottom and just got swamped, are especially well qualified to cover the implications of what we think is about to happen, with the peculiar wrinkle this time it's probably coming more for white-collar jobs than blue-collar jobs.
Right.
If you think about it, white-collar workers perhaps even more connected for their sense of being and existence and belonging on their job than many blue-collar workers are. So I think right here, right now, is the place to be assessing and covering and interrogating the effects of artificial intelligence, not just in the fascinating sci-fi sense of it, but just in terms of what happens in your community if suddenly a whole bunch of the jobs and economic structures we counted on all our lives aren't there anymore.
Especially as industrial jobs become, like the auto industry, that it becomes more caught up in things like AI.
Totally.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about Michigan politics. Your new...
You want another drink?
You can start now. Your new home state. And here in Michigan, we are very reliable. We are reliably conflicted voters, that we go from one to the other, from election to election. We're party switchers, or at least a critical mass of us are. In this environment, what advice would you give to candidates actually of both parties?
Well, there's only one party whose candidates have ever called me for advice in this election, but
we can start there.
I think the most important thing is to ensure that the conversations are close to people's everyday lives. I think it's very easy to get away from that. I think the internet pulls us away from that. I think the drama pulls us away from that. But if you look at really good you mentioned that my party's coalition includes people ranging from Alyssa Slotkin to Zohran Mamdani. What those two candidates have in common, I think, is that they were very effective by being very, very rooted in their sense of place and very, very focused on the things that were on people's mind, like cost of living. So even though they represent very different parts of the spectrum, they had just tactically speaking, they shared that sense of discipline, that willingness to go different places with their message, and that rootedness in the everyday reality that in a healthy politics should be what politics is all about. I think nothing can substitute for that. Personally, I've also done well by the philosophy of going everywhere you can, not just geographically, but media-wise. I think that's even more important now. Again, many of the voters that my party has struggled to connect with and who are less likely to vote but are absolutely reachable and persuadable, You're not going to find them tuning into political coverage. And yet politics will find them.
Yeah.
And if my side doesn't find them with our politics, the other side will be very happy to do that very quickly, as I think they have in particular through podcasts that are more oriented around sports or around culture, but carry a certain political energy in them too.
We had a couple listener questions to the It's Just Politics podcast. So we're going to do quick round robin. You want to do Rich Shubas?
One Richard Schuba. He is a pollster. He was a very smart one about Michigan politics, and we actually turn to him a lot. A lot of the people in this room probably know him. He says, what can we do to bring a renaissance to the institutions of American democracy?
Well, that's your speed round?
Number one.
30 seconds.
Look, I think the deepest, truest answers have to do with structural reform. And if it takes 30 years to get some of these things done, we should start right now. I'm talking about more proportional system for how our elections work, fair methods of voting, popular vote instead of an electoral college, constitutional amendments if necessary to get money out of our politics, so that there is just a better level of responsiveness between those institutions and the people. I think part of how they've lost legitimacy is that they seem less and less responsive. And even though, in my opinion, it won't surprise you to hear, I think that the current president is anything but responsive to what people actually need. Certainly the kind of burn the house down mentality that I think helped him to win is a result of people finding that their institutions are letting them down. I think generationally, anybody my age or younger has experienced a lot of policy failure related to that reason. I know structure stuff isn't sexy. The last time anybody managed to make it sexy was when John McCain made a big name for himself with campaign finance reform in the 90s, which proves it can be done. But the fact that it hasn't happened since proves how hard it is, too. But I think those things, tethered to something that isn't political on its face, but social, which is a culture of offline interaction where persuasion actually happens. Not a lot of persuasion going on online, but it is happening over beers at the Elks down on Bay Street, or over conversations at family dinner tables, or in break rooms at workplaces. Building that back up, I think, is wildly important, so that we can at least, not that we'll all reach the same conclusions, but we can at least be arguing about the same facts.
Follow up very quickly. I heard you recently say, and you mentioned that you'd been pushing for some reforms to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Tell me.
Well, I think that it is increasingly viewed as a partisan institution. I think we need to reform it so that it is less partisan. One proposal I've seen that would achieve that is one where you have a number of justices appointed by presidents from one party, a number appointed by presidents from another party, and a third group who can only become justices if all the others agree on them. So it just gives you a less polarized court. I've seen other ideas that are actually conceivably possible within the existing constitutional setup that we have that involve rotating justices on or off of the appellate bench. There's more than one way to get there. But right now we see, I mean, you can tell because we see justices timing their departure from the bench. Sometimes it feels like timing their departure from the earth based on, what party is in power at the time, which is not a healthy way for an independent judiciary to function.
We heard from Kate. She is a high school student. Her 18th birthday, when she will get to vote for the very first time, is Election Day 2026.
Wow.
And she says getting as many young people to vote is crucial. It's very important to her. She says, is there anything you'd like to say to encourage young people to vote when they come of age?
Oh, yes. I mean, the way I would put it, and it's great that she's motivated enough to ask that, because she'll be more effective persuading her classmates than anyone like me can. But the message from someone like me is, the longer you're planning to be here, the more you have at stake in a series of decisions that are being made right now. I believe that by the time my kids, who just turned 4, are getting into their careers, and I'm looking to retire in the 2050s, there will be a disproportionate attention paid to what we did in the 2020s and how we got it right or wrong on everything from artificial intelligence to the structure of our economy, to the fabric of our democracy, to the fate of social media, to the way we handle our climate. Those decisions made now will affect you well into the 2050s. And I hope and expect my kids will experience the turn of the next century in 2100. And so much of what the world is like then, what their possibilities are, what their everyday life is like, depends on what we do here right now. And so there is a particular level of having so much at stake and a particular level of moral authority that I think the younger you are, the more you have it. You should absolutely bring that to the polls the moment that you are legally eligible to vote.
We've got just a minute or two left, Pete Buttigieg, and I'm thinking a lot about having you in front of the broadcasters, and if you wanted to make some kind of big announcement in front of this group about your future. Sure, they would keep it quiet, but let's say you didn't want to make that big announcement here right now. I am curious, though, about your future. I don't think anyone, let's go back into the time machine again, those 13 years of I met the next president of the United States. I don't think anyone who hears you speak, who sees you on a national platform, doesn't wonder what is next for you. How are you thinking about your place in the future?
I mean, mostly I'm thinking about my place in the future of our house, because I got these 2 4-year-olds who are just running me ragged and kind of dominating my consciousness right now. I was driving them this morning up through all the construction of one of our DOT projects, actually, the M2272. Sorry about that. It's almost done. It's going to be fantastic.
Gretchen Whitmer always says, "I'm sorry and you're welcome."
Exactly. And one minute it was this conversation about basically my son, ever since he learned the origin story of Spider-Man, keeps demanding to know where we could find a radioactive spider, because clearly he wants to find one and get bit by one so he can become Spider-Man, not Superman, Spider-Man. And we have a whole conversation about that, and then we have a conversation about our dog, and then we're talking about something to do with our daughter's doll, and then my son is like, "Papa, when you die, will I also die?" It's like, no, buddy, no. Geez, where'd you get that? And we're talking through that. So I'm on this emotional roller coaster that is something that reminds me of, as somebody who lives and breathes public office, public life, and public affairs, what a gift it is, actually, to, for the first time in 15 years, not be in office or on the ballot. I'm working. I'm doing all kinds of stuff. You see me doing interviews. I'm doing some writing, private sector stuff. But I really love being able to lean into that. But for precisely that reason, that I care about my kids, I also know that I have to make myself useful politically. Right now, that's not running for office. And I'm more than fine with that right now. But it does mean you're going to see me making the case for candidates I believe in, writing up ideas that I believe in, talking about what my party could be doing right and might be doing wrong, weighing in, for better or for worse, on questions like artificial intelligence and the importance of journalism, and all the other things that I care about deeply and that I think are of such importance right now. It's just not a time when you can sit back on the sidelines and be content with life in a way that doesn't touch on how much we all have at stake in the public and political processes. But for this moment, sitting here right now, the only announcement I can make is that I've decided that my favorite flavor at Moomers is the cherries moobly, and y'all ought to stop there on the way out.
Excellent choice. But are you thinking at some point of running again for something?
Sure. Yeah, of course. I mean,
what might that be?
All right. Cherries moobly. No, of course you think about it, and you read polls, and you talk to friends, and people stop you on the street, and you think about it. But I thought really hard about running here in Michigan twice earlier this year, and thinking about it is different from deciding you're going to do it. And I'm also at my tender age of how old am I?
43.
43. Old enough to have to stop and do the math. I'm also old enough to know that running for office is not something you do unless you're really sure that it needs to be you and it needs to be now.
Pete Buttigieg, former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, former U.S. Transportation Secretary, former Democratic candidate for president, and now, of course, Michigan resident. Thanks, man. Finish that beer.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Pete Buttigieg on stage in Traverse City at a special Michigan Association of Broadcasters and Michigan Public Issues and Ale.
You can find out about more upcoming events by signing up for the It's Just Politics newsletter in your inbox every Friday with the latest Michigan political news.
And for today, that is It's Just Politics. I am Zoe Clark.
And I'm Rick Pluta.
Let's talk again next week.